The sharp, sterile chill of the Bellini's kitchen walk-in freezer bit through the thin polyester of my uniform. I stood in the dim fluorescent light, my back pressed against a stack of stainless steel prep tables, trying to steady my breathing. Every inhale tasted like raw red onions and expensive black truffles, a sickeningly rich combination summarizing the agonizing class divide of my reality. Out there, the dining room hummed with imported crystal and the careless murmurs of Chicago's untouchable elite. In here, I was a ghost, haunting the edges of a gilded world I could never touch. My right heel throbbed with burning agony. The cheap synthetic leather of my mandatory serving shoes had rubbed the skin raw, blisters forming over the course of this brutal, 12-hour double shift. I kept the injury hidden, forcing my weight awkwardly onto the ball of my foot. If Marcus saw me limping, he would immediately cut my weekend shifts, citing that visible pain disrupted the guest's luxury experience. I shoved my trembling hand into my apron, pulling out my tips, and flattening the damp bills against the freezing metal. $5, $10, $15, $22. I didn't see them as currency anymore, only strict survival metrics. $5 equated to 7 minutes of nebulizer solution for Toby's lungs. An inhaler refill cost $84, without the insurance Julian maliciously canceled during our divorce. $22 was never enough. Eliza, the shrill bark of Marcus Briggs sliced through the drone of the exhaust fans. I flinched, shoving the bills back into my apron. Marcus marched around the corner, his flushed face and ill-fitting designer tie, vibrating with anxious energy. He possessed the frantic insecurity of a man vastly inferior to the billionaires he served, choosing to take it out on the vulnerable women under his command. "Are you taking a paid vacation in the freezer, Vance?" Marcus sneered, stepping entirely too close, smelling of cheap peppermint and nervous sweat. "Table 7 is complaining about their lobster risotto. If you cannot keep up, I can find a desperate college girl to take your hours by morning." "I'm on it, Marcus," I murmured, keeping my voice flat. "See that you are," he snapped. "We have a highly secure VIP reservation arriving in an hour. Extremely high profile. The kind of money that buys and sells people like us before breakfast. If anyone embarrasses me tonight, they are gone without a final paycheck." "Yes," I said, escaping the suffocating chill. I pushed through the swinging doors, instantly hit by the overwhelming ambient warmth of the dining floor, plastering an invisible smile onto my face. I ignored the sharp sting of my bleeding heels and went back to serving people who looked right through me. By the time I unlocked the stubborn deadbolt of my apartment 3 hours later, my body felt like hollowed-out lead. The biting November wind had chilled me to the core, but the dark interior offered little relief. The old cast-iron radiator hissed a weak complaint, barely fighting off the damp cold seeping through the single-pane windows. The hallway smelled of stale cabbage and cheap bleach, a permanent reminder of my fallen status. Dropping my keys into the cracked ceramic bowl, the hollow clatter sounded too loud in the suffocating silence. Without removing my damp coat, I walked straight to the shadowed alcove in the corner of the living room. Toby was sound asleep, his tiny frame curled tightly under 2 threadbare fleece blankets. I stood silently at the edge of his second-hand crib, my chest tightening, as I listened to the uneven, raspy hitch in his breathing. Every inhale sounded like immense physical effort, a terrifying whistle that violently gripped my own lungs. I rested the back of my freezing hand against his flushed cheek. No fever, thank God. I sank into the broken springs of the armchair, physical exhaustion crashing over me. Unzipping my canvas duffel bag, my fingers searched past empty food containers for the only solid thing left in my chaotic world. Lorenzo's journal. I pulled out the heavy leather-bound notebook. The dark cover was worn smooth, smelling of old parchment and strong Italian espresso. My grandfather had carried it everywhere, a physical anchor to the old-world Sicilian heritage he stubbornly refused to let fade. Opening the cover with profound care, I stared at the yellowed pages filled with his elegant handwriting, capturing generations of idioms, poetry, and the precise grammatical rules of a regional dialect that barely existed anymore. I traced my index finger over a line of text, feeling the indentation where his pen had pressed too hard. The modern world outside was loud, cruel, and systematically designed to crush isolated women like me. But in these delicate pages, there was an unyielding dignity. Lonuri non sia cata, I mouthed silently into the dark room, careful not to disturb Toby's fragile sleep. Honor cannot be bought. I formed the ancient Sicilian vowels perfectly, feeling the rich cadence of the language roll over my tongue. Lorenzo had been uncompromising about my pronunciation, tapping his calloused knuckles against the kitchen table, until I dropped the flat American accent and properly respected the musicality of his homeland. A Sicilian does not beg, Eliza, he had told me once, his dark, fathomless eyes intense and absolute. We endure the cold, and we remember who we are. I closed my eyes, letting the phantom memory of his strict, loving voice calm my racing heart. Clutching the heavy leather journal tightly to my chest, I pulled my knees up. Tomorrow, I would have to face Marcus's condescension again. Tomorrow, I would have to beg the pharmacy to let me pay Toby's copay in installments. But for tonight, wrapped in the freezing quiet of this decaying room, I simply held on to the last remnants of my grandfather's pride, waiting for the dawn to break. The following evening, the ambient noise of Bellini's mirrored its usual chaotic, exhausting symphony of clinking silverware, loud, arrogant laughter, and the sharp hiss of the espresso machine. I was in the middle of calculating how many more tables I needed to turn to afford the copay on Toby's next albuterol inhaler when that entire symphony died. It happened the second the heavy mahogany front doors swung open. The temperature in the dining room seemed to drop 10 degrees in an instant, creating a sudden vacuum of air pressure that made my exhausted ears pop. Marcus Briggs, whose face had been a deep, angry red just moments before while berating a hostess, instantly drained of all color. He practically shoved a busboy into a hidden service alcove to clear the central path, his manicured hands shaking visibly. 6 men stepped out of the freezing November rain and into the golden, opulent light of the foyer. They moved with a synchronized, eerie quietness, their dark, expensive overcoats damp from the storm outside. But it was the man at the center of the defensive formation who commanded the absolute, suffocating silence of the room. He wore a bespoke charcoal suit that draped flawlessly over broad shoulders, moving with the measured, terrifying grace of an apex predator who knew there were no threats left to hunt. The sharp, overwhelming scent of cedarwood, bergamot, and rain-chilled leather cut straight through the heavy, suffocating aroma of roasted garlic and truffle oil. "Mr. Severino," Marcus stammered, his voice cracking in the quiet dining room as he practically folded his thin frame in half with an obsequious bow. "An absolute honor. We are entirely at your disposal. Your usual table in the back is prepared and waiting." Dante Severino did not look at him. He did not nod, did not offer a polite murmur of acknowledgement, nor did he break his slow, deliberate stride. He walked past my manager, as if Marcus were nothing more than a piece of cheap invisible furniture blocking the hallway. The men flowed into the secluded rear section of the restaurant, an elevated alcove draped in heavy crimson velvet curtains that separated the elite from the merely wealthy. I stood frozen by the service station, my fingers gripping the edge of a stainless steel counter, so tightly my knuckles ached. The dull, throbbing pain in my swollen feet was entirely eclipsed by the sudden spike of adrenaline flooding my veins. Dante approached the head of the private table. He did not sit. Instead, he reached out with a large, calloused hand and lifted one of the crystal wine glasses by its delicate stem. The entire restaurant seemed to hold its collective breath. Waiters stopped mid-step, balancing heavy plates on their shoulders. Diners lowered their silver forks, afraid to scrape them against their porcelain plates. Dante stared intently at the curve of the glass. He tilted it slightly, catching the warm amber light of the chandelier overhead. A microscopic water smudge, a careless, rushed mistake from the dish pit, sat near the rim. He didn't yell. He didn't demand a new glass, nor did he threaten anyone's job like Marcus constantly did. He merely set the crystal back onto the thick white linen tablecloth with a soft, resonant clink. That single, quiet sound echoed through the paralyzed dining room. It was a terrifying display of absolute authority, a command that required zero volume. Marcus was shaking so hard his plastic clipboard rattled against his hip. He snapped his fingers frantically at the nearest server, his eyes wide with sheer, unadulterated panic, desperate to fix the invisible flaw before the silence turned violent. "Vance," Marcus hissed, his fingers digging bruisingly into my shoulder as he dragged me violently behind the wooden partition. "You take them." "Me?" I whispered, my throat suddenly bone dry, my mind racing through a panicked inventory of my unpaid bills. "I'm not trained for the VIP alcove. If I mess up, you'll fire me." The usual guy just dropped a tray of plates in the kitchen because his hands were shaking too badly. Marcus spat, beads of greasy sweat pooling on his forehead. "You don't drop things." You need this job to feed your kid, which means you won't make a mistake. Go. Do not make eye contact. Do not speak unless they address you first. He shoved a heavy silver tray into my hands, loaded with a fresh, immaculate crystal glass and a chilled bottle of imported sparkling water. The scratchy, cheap polyester of my uniform collar rubbed raw against my neck as I stepped out from the safety of the partition. Every step toward the back alcove felt like wading through deep, freezing water. My heart hammered violently against my ribs, a stark contrast to the absolute stillness of the men guarding the perimeter. As I crossed the invisible threshold into their private space, the air shifted again. It felt heavier here, dense with quiet danger and the rich, dark scent of expensive tobacco. Dante was seated at the head of the table, his broad shoulders relaxed against the velvet upholstery. The man to his right leaned in, murmuring something low and urgent, scanning the room with hyper-vigilant eyes. I approached Dante's right side, my eyes locked firmly on the pristine white tablecloth to avoid the sharp, obsidian gaze of his guards. As I reached out to carefully swap the smudged glass for the pristine one, the boss began to speak. He wasn't speaking standard Italian. The cadence was entirely different, harsh, guttural, and deeply rhythmic. I poured the water, my wrist perfectly steady despite the frantic racing of my pulse. I could feel the heat radiating off his massive frame, a physical warmth that sharply contrasted with the freezing dampness of the storm outside. A heavy, brushed steel and obsidian watch rested on his wrist, a casual display of wealth that could likely pay off my entire hospital debt 10 times over. I listened to the rough syllables rolling off his tongue. He was delivering a set of instructions to the man beside him. I noticed a subtle, tense twitch in Dante's jaw as he dropped a specific, archaic noun to describe a territory dispute. My breath caught painfully in my chest. I knew that word. It wasn't something you learned in a high school language class, nor was it a phrase wealthy tourists picked up during summer vacations in modern Rome. It was the heavy, protective, and deeply insular dialect of the old Sicilian underworld. My mind instantly flashed back to the small, dim light of my freezing apartment, to the worn, leather-bound pages of Lorenzo's journal. My late grandfather had meticulously documented these exact linguistic anomalies. I could almost smell the faint trace of his pipe tobacco rising from the paper. He used to sit me on his knee, his weathered finger tracing the harsh consonants of his native region, explaining how a single shifted vowel changed a sentence from a casual greeting into a lethal promise. Dante's voice dropped an octave, the gravelly tone vibrating in the quiet space, as he strung together a complex honor-bound directive. I stepped back slowly, clutching my empty silver tray to my chest like a desperate shield. I wasn't just a terrified waitress eavesdropping on dangerous mobsters anymore. I was a linguistic witness, silently translating the ancient, blood-soaked grammar of my grandfather's past right here in the middle of a modern Chicago restaurant. And Dante Severino was using the dialect with a flawless, terrifying precision. The cut crystal tumbler in Dante's hand caught the ambient amber light of the private dining room, turning the scotch into liquid gold. I stood frozen near the edge of the mahogany table, a freshly uncorked bottle of Barolo, feeling like a lead weight in my aching hands. My feet throbbed against the polished hardwood floor, a constant reminder of the 10 hours I had already been on the clock. He leaned forward, his broad shoulders stretching the bespoke charcoal fabric of his suit. His intoxicating, bespoke cologne drifted toward me, an olfactory signature of absolute power. As he locked his obsidian eyes on the older man seated across from him, he murmured a phrase intended to invoke the unbreakable honor of his family's bloodline. But the words that left his mouth made my spine stiffen. "U nostro sangue havi macchiato a terra," Dante stated smoothly. He had attempted to use a classic idiom about their blood defending the earth. Instead, he slipped into a modern Italian compound verb structure, using havi macchiato, a direct translation of the present perfect, rather than the archaic subjunctive past. By forcing the modern tense into the ancient structure, he completely reversed its meaning. He hadn't said that their blood would defend the ground. He had just declared that his own family had stained and dishonored the earth. The men surrounding the table remained stone-faced, disconnected from the deep roots of the true dialect. But I knew. I could almost feel the ghost of Lorenzo Bianchi, sighing in disappointment. My grandfather had spent countless evenings by the light of a flickering kitchen bulb, forcing me to memorize the exact cadence of our heritage. Hearing it butchered felt like a physical violation, Every instinct I had developed over 3 years of grinding poverty screamed at me to remain invisible. If I spoke, I risked the meager paycheck that paid for Toby's inhalers. But the mispronounced words hung in the air, a jagged, ugly scratch across a beautiful painting. My fingers tightened around the cool glass neck of the wine bottle until my knuckles turned stark white. The correction bypassed my survival instincts entirely. I stepped half a pace forward into the pool of dim golden light. My rubber-soled work shoes let out a faint squeak against the hardwood, but it sounded like a gunshot in the tense atmosphere. "It is definicy," I said, my voice quiet but ringing with startling clarity in the silent room. The temperature in the dining room seemed to drop 10 degrees in a single second. The older man flinched. The 3 large guards near the heavy oak doors shifted instantly, their hands moving toward the inside of their bespoke jackets. I stood perfectly still, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I didn't look at the guards. I looked directly at the back of Dante's head. He froze. The tumbler stopped halfway to his lips. Slowly, deliberately, he lowered the glass to the table. The ice cubes clinked softly, the only sound remaining in the entire restaurant. "Excuse me?" The words were barely a whisper, yet they carried a lethal, pressurized weight. He turned his head, and for the first time, those fathomless obsidian eyes locked directly onto mine. Something in that gaze made me feel simultaneously seen and hunted. The instinct to apologize burned in my veins, but then I remembered the fraying cuffs of my uniform and the countless hours my grandfather had spent preserving our language. I refused to let this man butcher the only inheritance I had left. I held the bottle steady. "You used the modern present perfect, Javi Macchiato. You just told him that your family's blood has disgraced and stained the earth." I took a shallow breath, tasting the expensive cigar smoke in the air. The proverb requires the imperfect subjunctive. "Siu nostru sangu definisi a terra." If our blood were to defend the earth, by mixing the modern tense with the old dialect, you ruined the poetic meter and insulted your own ancestors. The silence that followed was a suffocating, heavy vacuum. One of the guards took a sharp step forward, his jaw tight, ready to drag me out of the room for the disrespect I had just shown. I braced myself for the physical impact, my somatic awareness hyper-focused on the cold air biting at the back of my neck. Dante raised a single, calloused hand. He didn't even look at the guard. He just lifted 2 fingers, and the man instantly halted, stepping backward as if he had been physically struck. The Mafia boss turned his chair fully around to face me. The movement was slow, measured, and entirely terrifying. He evaluated me. I could feel his gaze tracing the scratchy polyester of my apron, the exhausted shadows under my eyes, and the stubborn tilt of my chin. He wasn't looking at a waitress anymore. He was analyzing a puzzle. "Definici," he repeated softly, testing the heavy, archaic word on his tongue. The way he spoke at this time was flawless, rolling the consonants with a dark, velvet resonance that sent a completely involuntary shiver down my spine. He leaned back in his leather chair, steepling his large hands together. The violent rage of a powerful man publicly corrected by a nobody was entirely absent. Instead, there was a sharp, focused intensity, a sudden, quiet obsession. "That dialect hasn't been spoken correctly in this city for 40 years. Dante stated, his voice a low, commanding rumble that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. He tilted his head, his gaze stripping away the invisible walls I had built to survive the grueling service industry. "So tell me, who taught you how to speak to me like that?" My throat suddenly went bone dry. The amber light overhead seemed to flicker, casting long, dangerous shadows across the mahogany table. I was an invisible woman. A ghost who was merely supposed to pour the wine, clear the plates, and disappear into the kitchen. And yet, beneath the crushing weight of his attention, the exhaustion of my 10-hour shift temporarily vanished. The instinct to retreat, to mumble an apology and scurry back to the safety of the dish pit, warring with the fierce pride Nano Lorenzo, had drilled into my very bones. I swallowed hard, acutely aware of the expensive, oppressive silence pressing in from all sides. Toby's face flashed in my mind, his sweet, pale cheeks, and the terrifying wheeze of his asthma. My son needed my meager paycheck. He needed me to keep my head down and apologize to the men in the bespoke suits, but, as Dante Severino watched me, his dark eyes absorbing the light rather than reflecting it, I realized it was entirely too late for that. The invisible line had already been crossed. "My grandfather," I finally answered, my voice betraying none of the absolute terror seizing my chest. "Lorenzo Bianchi. He taught me that some things are too important to be lost in translation. The silence that followed my revelation was absolute. A sudden, heavy vacuum that made the blood rush in my ears. The distant, muted sounds of the main restaurant. The clinking of crystal glasses, the soft jazz, the faint smell of roasted garlic, seemed to belong to an entirely different universe. The men at the table had gone perfectly still, their forks hovering mid-air. Dante's eyes remained fixed on me. The air around him felt dense, charged with a quiet, terrifying electricity that prickled the hairs on my arms. I swallowed hard, the dryness in my throat a sharp, visceral reminder of the 12 hours I had already spent on my feet today. My cheap, stiff polyester uniform clung uncomfortably to my damp skin, a stark, humiliating contrast to the impeccable, bespoke charcoal wool of his suit. A small, rational part of my brain screamed at me to apologize, to bow my head, to disappear into the kitchen and pray I still had a job tomorrow. Toby's pale, sleeping face flashed in my mind. If I was fired tonight, the money for his asthma medication vanished with my next paycheck. But the words had already been spoken, and the pride of my bloodline demanded I stand my ground. I would not cower. "Who taught you to speak that dialect?" he asked again. His voice was a low, resonant rumble, entirely stripped of any anger. What remained was a cold, focused intensity that seemed to lock me in place. "My grandfather," I replied. My voice wavered for a fraction of a second before I forced it steady, drawing a slow breath to calm my racing pulse. The memory of his worn, leather-bound journal resting on my nightstand gave me an unexpected anchor. I lifted my chin, refusing to shrink under that dark, fathomless gaze. "He was born in Palermo. He taught me the old ways, the exact cadence. He said that language is a measure of a man's honor, and to mispronounce it is to forget the weight of the ancestors." Dante tilted his head slightly. His familiar woodsy fragrance drifted toward me, a masculine signature that commanded the space. "And what was your grandfather's name?" he asked softly. "Lorenzo Bianchi," I said. The reaction was instantaneous, yet entirely devoid of the violence I had braced myself for. Dante's dark, obsidian eyes widened, a flicker of genuine shock breaking through his composed, lethal facade. His large, calloused right hand, which had been idly turning a heavy silver lighter, stopped moving. Slowly, with a deliberate reverence, he lowered the lighter to the mahogany table. The metallic clink of the silver against the polished wood echoed like a gavel, striking a block in the silent room. The men around him exchanged rapid, imperceptible glances. A large guard standing by the door, who had been completely still, suddenly shifted his posture, reflecting the monumental change in his boss. The tension in the room instantly transformed, shifting from the threat of imminent violence to a strange, suspended awe. Dante leaned back in his leather chair, his broad shoulders relaxing against the upholstery. The predatory tension that had radiated from him just moments before vanished entirely. In its place was a quiet, profound humility that completely altered the gravity of the room. He looked at me not as a subordinate waitress who had spoken out of turn, but as if I were a ghost stepping directly out of a legend. "Lorenzo Bianchi," Dante murmured, the syllables rolling off his tongue with a deep, respectful resonance that made my chest tighten. The scholar of the old code. I stood frozen, gripping the edge of my plastic serving tray so tightly, my knuckles turned white and ached. The throbbing, persistent pain in my swollen ankles temporarily faded into the background, eclipsed by the sheer surrealism of the moment. My grandfather had always been a quiet, proud man, spending his evenings reading his leather-bound journal and teaching me the poetry of our ancestors, under the dim light of a cheap kitchen lamp. He had never spoken of wealthy, dangerous men in bespoke suits. Dante reached out, his long, elegant fingers slowly tracing the polished edge of the table. The warm, ambient lighting of the private room caught the heavy silver of his rings. He did not look at his men. His full, undivided attention was locked entirely on me, analyzing every detail of my stance. "Your grandfather," Dante began, his voice dropping to an intimate, measured cadence that seemed meant only for my ears, was a brilliant man, a mentor to many who needed guidance when the laws of this country failed them. I felt a sudden chill run down my spine. I wanted to step back, to maintain the invisible, protective barrier between my desperate, working-class reality and his world of absolute power, but my feet remained rooted to the floor. "He was a teacher," I said defensively, my chest tightening as a wave of protective instinct surged through me. "He worked in a public library. He was a philosopher of our blood," Dante corrected gently. There was no mockery in his tone, only a quiet, absolute certainty. 30 years ago, my own father was accused of a betrayal he did not commit. A betrayal that would have meant a death sentence under our laws. It was your grandfather, Lorenzo, who stepped forward. He used nothing but his words, his absolute knowledge of the ancient code of justice, to prove my father's innocence. He saved my family's honor and my father's life. My breath hitched in my throat. The image of Nonno Lorenzo, with his reading glasses and gentle smile, clashing with the brutal, unforgiving reality of a Mafia tribunal, was almost impossible to reconcile. Yet, looking into Dante's unwavering gaze, feeling the heavy sincerity in his words, I knew it was the truth. Dante's eyes slowly swept over me. He took in the fraying, threadbare cuffs of my uniform, the faint stain of spilled espresso on my apron, the dark circles of chronic exhaustion under my eyes, and the cheap, cracked watch resting on my wrist. I felt my face flush with a sudden, burning humiliation. I was hypervisible, stripped of my daily armor, standing before a man of limitless wealth while I was secretly calculating if I could afford a loaf of bread tomorrow, after buying Toby's inhaler. Lorenzo's direct air, Dante murmured, a dangerous edge of protective anger bleeding into his smooth tone as he studied my worn appearance. Living in this city, serving plates in a place like this. I work hard, I snapped, the defensive pride flaring up hot and fast to mask my acute, terrifying vulnerability. I lifted my tray slightly, a pathetic shield against his overwhelming presence. Every muscle in my back ached, screaming for rest, but I couldn't afford to show weakness. Not when Toby's fragile lungs depended on my ability to endure this grueling life. I take care of my family. I do not doubt your strength. Eliza, he replied instantly, his voice a steady, grounding force that seemed to lower the pressure of the air around us. My heart skipped a beat. He hadn't asked my name, yet he spoke it with absolute familiarity. But a Bianchi, Dante continued, his dark gaze locking onto mine with a fierce, unwavering promise, should never have to exhaust herself just to survive the winter. The harsh squeak of rubber soles against the polished floor broke the suffocating silence. Marcus Briggs, his face flushed red, stormed toward the table. My manager's French-ranked anxiety clashed with the cold, pressurized stillness Dante had established. Marcus didn't care about the Sicilian dialect. He only saw a disposable waitress speaking out of turn to the most dangerous patron in Chicago. Before I could step back, Marcus's damp hand clamped down hard on my wrist, sending a sharp jolt of pain up my forearm. What do you think you're doing? Marcus hissed, his cheap pine cologne invading my space. You do not speak to the guests. Go to the back. Turn in your apron. You're completely done here, Eliza. The arithmetic of poverty hijacked my brain. 3 days of Toby's asthma medication left. Exactly $42 remaining until Friday. My throat went dry, the metallic taste of sheer panic pooling on my tongue. I tried to pull away, fighting the absolute terror of losing my only lifeline. I didn't have to fight him off. The temperature in the immediate vicinity seemed to drop 10 degrees in a single second. A mahogany chair scraped the floor as Dante rose. His refined, masculine aura washed over me, overpowering Marcus's cheap cologne. The impeccably tailored man moved with a lethal grace that made his security detail instantly adjust their postures. Marcus froze, realizing too late he had crossed a dangerous line. Dante stepped into our personal space and placed his large, calloused hand gently onto Marcus's shoulder. It looked friendly, but Dante's thumb dug inward. His long fingers wrapped over the cheap suit fabric, tightening until the manager's collarbone visibly stiffened. His knuckles went white with controlled pressure. "Remove your hand," Dante whispered. His tone was perfectly pleasant and entirely devoid of mercy. Marcus released me as if my skin had caught fire, stumbling backward. "Mr. Severino," Marcus stammered. "I apologize. She isn't supposed to bother our VIPs." Dante's grip didn't loosen. The downward pressure increased, forcing the manager to tilt his neck uncomfortably. "You are mistaken," Dante murmured. "She is not staff to me. She is the granddaughter of Lorenzo Bianchi. Her employment here is strictly secure, but her shifts are at her own discretion. If she is ever disrespected here again, I will close your doors, permanently." Marcus swallowed hard. "Of course. Yes, sir. Whatever she needs." "Walk away," Dante commanded softly. Marcus scrambled backward, retreating toward the kitchen doors like a hunted animal. The kitchen doors swung shut. I stood frozen, my wrist still throbbing. I felt invisible and hypervisible simultaneously. A ghost who had just been dragged violently into the light. I smoothed trembling fingers over the fraying cuffs of my scratchy uniform. Survival meant staying quiet, and enduring whatever the world threw at me so I could go home to my son. Dante turned his focus back to me. The dangerous authority vanished, replaced by an observant stillness. He reached into his charcoal jacket. He withdrew a sleek, heavy piece of matte metal, the black card. It caught no light whatsoever, looking less like a standard financial instrument and more like carved obsidian. Without a word, Dante reached across the white linen tablecloth. He picked up my green server's checkbook, holding my meager collection of crumpled bills, and slid the limitless card underneath the leather flap. My breath hitched. The cheap, worn vinyl of my daily struggle was now physically pressing against an instrument of absolute wealth. "I cannot take that," I said instantly. My defensive pride flared up like a shield. "I appreciate what you just did, but I don't take charity, Mr. Severino. I earn my way." Dante paused. He didn't look offended by my rapid rejection. A faint glimmer of profound respect hardened his angular features. "I make it my business to know everything about the people who interest me," Dante said, his voice lowering. "I know about the grueling double shifts you work. I know about the heating bill you are ignoring. And I know about the pediatric asthma specialists you are trying to afford for Toby." A cold spike of adrenaline pierced my chest. How much did this man already know about my life? Before I could step back, Dante closed the distance. The solid heat radiating from his large frame offered a startling contrast to the constant, bone-deep chill I had carried all day. "This is not charity, Eliza," he stated. "Your grandfather gave my family something money could never buy. He gave us our history. I owe Lorenzo Bianchi a deep blood debt of honor. To allow his bloodline to suffer in poverty, to allow his great-grandson to go without breathing medicine, would be an unforgivable stain on my name." He reached out, his knuckles grazing the table near my hand. The sheer gravity of his physical proximity made my pulse race erratically. "Use the card," Dante commanded gently, his Sicilian accent wrapping around the words like dark velvet. "For the boy's doctors, for whatever you need to rest. If you refuse it, you do not preserve your pride. You only insult your grandfather's memory." He didn't wait for a rebuttal. He knew exactly what he was doing, expertly trapping my stubborn independence beneath the one thing I valued more than pride, my son's survival. Dante offered one last, measured nod, his dark eyes locking onto mine. Then, he turned and walked toward the exit, his elite security detail falling into a seamless formation behind him. I stood entirely alone in the empty dining section. Staring down at the table, the heavy metal of the black card felt like an anchor pulling me out of the freezing ocean I had been drowning in for years, tying me, inextricably, to a dangerous, beautiful new shore. The lock on my apartment door always stuck. I had to jiggle the key twice, lifting the handle just a fraction of an inch, before the deadbolt gave way with a grinding metallic clatter. The hallway behind me smelled of boiled cabbage and damp drywall, but stepping inside my unit offered no real relief. The air in the cramped living room was stifling, heavy with the humid output of the cheap vaporizer running in the corner. I locked the door behind me, sliding the safety chain into place, and walked straight to the small alcove I had converted into a bedroom. Toby was asleep. The rhythmic, slightly wheezing sound of his breathing filled the narrow space. I stood there for a long time, listening to his small chest rise and fall. His skin was pale in the dim light of the street lamp filtering through the blinds, his tiny hands curled into fists against the frayed blanket. The chronic asthma had drained so much of his energy lately, and the completely empty inhaler sitting on the nightstand was a ticking clock I couldn't ignore. My legs felt like lead. The exhaustion of the double shift at Bellini's finally caught up to me, settling deep into the marrow of my bones. I moved to the kitchen, if it could even be called that, a narrow strip of peeling linoleum, a dripping faucet, and a wobbly laminate table. I sank into the mismatched wooden chair and let out a breath that shuddered past my dry lips. With trembling fingers, I reached into the pocket of my uniform apron and pulled out the small, heavy rectangle Dante Severino had left on my serving tray. I set the black card down on the scarred laminate table. It sat there, an alien artifact in my world of counted pennies and past due notices. The card wasn't just plastic. It was forged from matte titanium, cool and unnervingly heavy, absorbing the flickering light of the overhead bulb, rather than reflecting it. There were no numbers, no bank logos, only a sleek magnetic strip and a small, deeply embossed emblem of a falcon, the crest of a family that operated entirely above the law. I stared at the matte finish of the metal, catching a warped, shadowy reflection of my own face. Dark circles bruised the skin under my eyes. My hair was escaping its messy bun, and the collar of my cheap, polyester uniform was stained with the remnants of a disastrous shift. But the card was pristine. It represented unlimited, unquestioned capital. With a single swipe at the 24-hour pharmacy, I could buy Toby's medication. I could pay off the hospital debt that had been drowning me for a year. I wouldn't have to count the scoops of formula or skip my own meals, but a cold knot of dread tightened in my stomach. The smell of cedarwood and bergamot still seemed to cling to my clothes, a phantom reminder of the lethal, quiet man who had handed me this lifeline. Men like Dante did not offer charity. They made investments. They collected debts. By taking this money, I was inviting the absolute darkest corner of the Chicago syndicate into my fragile, carefully guarded life. Was I trading my family's freedom for a few months of safety? The titanium felt like a heavy chain, waiting to snap shut around my wrist. But then Toby coughed in the other room, a harsh, rattling sound that tore through my chest. Pride was a luxury for people who could breathe easily. I grabbed the black card, shoved it into the pocket of my threadbare winter coat, and decided to walk to the corner pharmacy right now. The stairwell of my building was a narrow, concrete shaft that permanently smelled of stale beer and bleach. The overhead fluorescent tube flickered sporadically, casting harsh, strobe-like shadows on the cracked walls. I zipped my coat up to my chin, bracing myself for the freezing November wind waiting outside the lobby doors. My worn sneakers squeaked faintly against the damp stairs. I only made it to the second-floor landing before a figure stepped out from the shadows beneath the stairs, entirely blocking my path. "Working late again, Lizzie?" My pulse spiked, a violent thud against my ribs. I knew that voice. I knew the specific arrogant drawl, and immediately, the sour stench of cheap whiskey and stale cigarettes hit my nose. Julian Kincaid leaned against the rusted banister, his posture aggressively casual. He wore a faux leather jacket that he hadn't paid for, and a smug, resentful smirk that made my stomach churn. My ex-husband always seemed to materialize exactly when my defenses were at their lowest, a vulture circling the wreckage he had helped create. "Get out of my way, Julian," I said, keeping my voice low and steady. I clutched the railing, refusing to take a step back. "I don't have time for this." "Oh, you don't have time?" He pushed off the wall, his boots scuffing the concrete as he closed the distance between us. He was taller than me, broader, and he used his physical size the way a bully used a weapon, crowding into my space, forcing me to lean away from his alcohol-laced breath. "You have time to serve rich pricks downtown until midnight. But you can't spare 5 minutes for the father of your kid? You lost the right to call yourself his father when you emptied our bank account and left us to be evicted." I snapped, the defensive anger burning through my exhaustion. "Move." I tried to step around him, but Julian's hand shot out. His fingers clamped brutally around my wrist, digging into the soft tissue with a sudden, sharp violence. The pain flared up my arm, a bright burst of agony that made me gasp. "Don't turn your back on me," he hissed, the faux casual demeanor, dropping to reveal the pathetic, grasping rage underneath. He yanked my arm, pulling me off balance. "I know you got paid tonight. I talked to the landlord. You're holding out on me, Lizzie. Hand over the cash." "Let go of me." I gritted my teeth, struggling against his grip, but he only squeezed harder. The contrast was sickening. Dante possessed enough power to crush cities, yet his presence had been perfectly still. His authority absolute, without ever needing to raise a finger. The man holding me had nothing, was nothing, and so he resorted to bruising the wrist of a tired woman in a dark, freezing stairwell. "I'm not asking you, ungrateful bitch," Julian spat, using his free hand to yank at the pocket of my coat. "Give me the money. You owe me. I owe you nothing." I shoved my free hand against his chest, trying to push him away, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm in my throat. My fingers brushed against the hard, unyielding square of titanium hidden in my pocket, the black card. If Julian found it, he wouldn't just steal my lifeline. He would unknowingly draw the attention of the syndicate, dragging Toby and me into a violently dangerous crossfire that we could never escape. The metallic taste of panic pooled in my mouth as I braced my weight against the concrete wall, realizing I had survived too much to be broken by a coward. The harsh yellow glare of the street lamp illuminated the smug, venomous curl of Julian's lip. I could still smell the stale beer and cheap cologne clinging to his expensive, unpaid-for trench coat as he took a deliberate step closer, backing me against the damp, brick wall of my apartment building. My pulse hammered violently against my throat. a frantic bird trapped in a cage of ribs. But I clamped my jaw shut, refusing to let him see me tremble. Every muscle in my exhausted body screamed at me to run, but pride rooted me to the spot. You think you can just walk away from me, Eliza? My ex-husband sneered, his voice dropping to a low, mocking register. He didn't raise his hands. He didn't have to. Instead, he unlatched the brass clasp of his sleek leather briefcase. It was a prop he carried to look like a legitimate businessman, rather than a bottom-feeding opportunist, living off credit card debt. He pulled out a thick, ivory-colored envelope. The heavy bond paper looked obscenely expensive, a stark, clinical contrast to the cracked concrete beneath our feet and the frayed, stained cuffs of my waitress uniform. Even in the dim light, the embossed logo of a high-end corporate law firm caught the glow of the street lamp, signaling a level of financial warfare I could never hope to match. "What is that?" I whispered, my voice sounding incredibly thin in the freezing night air. Julian didn't answer right away. He simply stepped into my space, invading the narrow gap between us, and slapped the crisp legal envelope directly against my chest. The sharp edge of the paper stung through my thin coat, forcing me to instinctively catch the document before it fell into a muddy puddle at my feet. "It's the custody petition," he said, his eyes gleaming with malicious triumph. "I'm taking Toby, full physical and legal custody." The world tilted off its axis. The damp oxygen instantly vanished from my lungs, replaced by a suffocating icy vacuum. I stared down at the bold, sterile print on the envelope. The metallic taste of panic pooled in my mouth as I pressed my shoulders back against the rough, cold brick, desperately trying to ground my reeling senses. "You have no right," I forced out, my fingers digging into the rigid corners of the document until my knuckles turned white. "You don't even pay child support. You don't even know the name of his asthma medication. Rights don't matter in the real world, sweetheart. Resources do," Julian replied smoothly, his tone dripping with calculated, fake sympathy. He reached out, tracing a mocking line down the peeling, water-damaged paint of the building's exterior. "Look at where you live. Look at your pathetic, exhausted little life. You're a waitress working double shifts just to keep the lights on, drowning in medical debt. A judge will take one look at your bank accounts, at this miserable excuse for a home, and declare you an unfit mother before you can even open your mouth." He was using the law as a garrote, slowly and methodically strangling my ability to fight back. It was a sophisticated, systemic trap designed to exploit my exact financial vulnerability. "You can't afford a lawyer, Eliza. You can't even afford to keep the heat running," he taunted, leaning in close enough for me to feel the heat of his breath. "Sign the waiver. Surrender him to me quietly, and maybe I'll let you visit on alternating weekends. Fight me in court, and I will make sure my attorneys leave you with absolutely nothing." Julian turned on his heel, his leather shoes clicking sharply against the wet asphalt. He disappeared into the shadows of the alley, leaving me standing completely alone in the biting cold, clutching the weapon he had just used to destroy my existence. The deadbolt of my apartment door slid into place with a metallic scrape, but there was absolutely no safety in the sound. The silence of the cramped kitchen felt suffocating, heavier and darker than the freezing rain outside. I didn't reach for the overhead light switch. I simply didn't have the strength to look at the peeling linoleum, the cracked countertops, or the terrifying pile of past-due utility bills stacked next to the rusted sink. I moved mechanically, my wet shoes squeaking softly against the uneven floorboards as I crossed the small room. My hands were entirely numb, stiff from the November chill, as I dropped the custody petition onto the scarred wooden dining table. The stark white paper seemed to glow in the dim ambient light, filtering through the street-facing window, a clinical, terrifying reminder of my own absolute powerlessness. My gaze shifted slowly to the object resting just inches away from the legal threat. Lorenzo's journal. My grandfather's worn, leather-bound notebook sat exactly where I had left it this morning, a silent witness to my collapse. The cover was soft from decades of handling, deeply etched with the oils of his hands and the immense weight of his legacy. I reached out, my trembling fingers tracing the familiar, faded spine. A ragged sob tore through my throat, a sound so raw, ugly, and broken that it didn't even feel like it belonged to my own body. The sheer exhaustion of the double shift, the terror of losing my child, and the crushing weight of my poverty all collided in a single, devastating moment. I picked up the journal, sinking slowly to my knees on the cold, unforgiving floor. I pressed the soft leather against my forehead, closing my eyes tightly as the tears finally spilled over, hot and bitter against my freezing, wind-chapped skin. "I'm sorry, Nano," I whispered into the empty darkness, my shoulders shaking uncontrollably. "I don't know what to do." I wept silently, biting hard into my lower lip to keep quiet, so I wouldn't wake Toby sleeping in the next room. The rough, familiar texture of the notebook offered a fleeting sense of comfort, but the devastating reality remained untouched. All of Lorenzo's old-world honor, his beautiful Sicilian idioms, his stern lessons on working-class pride and resilience. They were completely useless against Julian's modern legal manipulation. Honor could not pay a $10,000 retainer fee. Pride could not buy a wealthy judge's favor. The systemic bureaucratic violence of a custody battle didn't care about a mother's fierce devotion. It only cared about the metrics of wealth, stability, and power. Things I simply did not possess. I pulled the journal away from my face, wiping the dampness from my cheeks with the back of my wrist. The scent of old paper and dried ink filled my senses, mingling painfully with the lingering chill of the street rain clinging to my uniform. If I stayed passive, if I tried to fight Julian, with nothing but my stubborn independence and a minimum wage paycheck, I would lose my son. I was entirely alone against a predator who knew exactly how to use the system to crush me without throwing a single physical punch. But as my eyes adjusted to the dark, my gaze drifted past the custody petition and landed on my worn canvas workbag slung over the chair. Deep inside one of the zippered pockets was a small, heavy rectangle of matte titanium, the black card, Dante Severino. He was a dangerous man, a predator steeped in a world of absolute, lethal authority that deeply terrified my survival instincts. His world was signaled by charcoal bespoke suits and the rich scent of cedarwood, a life far beyond my comprehension. But he also understood the true, uncompromising nature of power, and he possessed the exact kind of overwhelming, ruthless resources I needed to break Julian's trap. I could no longer afford the luxury of fighting this war alone. If I wanted to keep Toby safe, I had to seek out the one man who could equalize the board, even if it meant stepping into a gilded cage of my own making. The steady, rhythmic hum of the advanced respiratory monitor was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. It cut through the silence of the private suite, a mechanical testament to the fact that my son was finally safe. Unlike the crowded public ward downstairs, defined by peeling paint and frantic shouts, this room on the top floor of the pediatric wing was a different world. The ambient lighting was a soft amber. The air didn't smell like bleach and panic. It carried a faint, soothing scent of clean linen. Toby lay in the center of the oversized hospital bed, looking painfully small but peaceful. I sat on the edge of the plush velvet armchair, running my fingers through his soft, sweat-free hair. His chest rose and fell in a smooth rhythm. The terrifying, wet rattle that usually accompanied his severe asthma attacks was completely gone. All of this, the dedicated respiratory therapist checking in every 30 minutes, the absolute quiet of the exclusive wing, was entirely paid for. My hand slipped into the pocket of my threadbare coat, my fingertips brushing the cold, titanium edge of the black card. Its physical weight felt like an anchor. Dante had left it for me, and in a moment of terrifying maternal desperation, when Toby's lips turned pale blue, I had used it. That single swipe of metal instantly bypassed the hospital's billing department. It bought my son's breath. But as I listened to Toby's easy breathing, the crushing reality of my situation tightened around my throat like a physical grip. In my worn purse lay the thick pages of the custody petition. Julian didn't care about my son's health. He had never once paid for an inhaler. The legal threat was merely a weapon designed to punish me for leaving him. His lawyer had drafted a document so full of inflated financial claims that I knew a public defender wouldn't stand a chance. I was just a waitress drowning in debt. My ex-husband had wealthy parents willing to fund his vindictive games. The court system wouldn't see a fiercely devoted mother. They would only see a bank account in the red and a woman who couldn't afford a proper lawyer. I watched a private nurse quietly check Toby's vitals and slip out without a sound. The level of attentive care was a visceral reminder of the invisible walls separating my daily survival from the realm of absolute power. I had swallowed my pride to save my child's life. Now, I had to do something even more terrifying to keep him. I needed protection the conventional law could not provide. I needed to speak to the man who understood the legacy of my grandfather, Lorenzo Bianchi, a man whose authority bypassed the corrupt system entirely. The biting Chicago wind whipped harshly against my face as I stepped out of the cab. The exterior of the elite social club gave nothing away. It was an imposing structure of dark stone, blending seamlessly into the affluent architecture of the Gold Coast. Two men in immaculately tailored dark suits stood by the heavy oak doors. They weren't just standard bouncers. The precise way they scanned the street spoke of organized, lethal efficiency. I approached the entrance, my cheap boots scuffing against the pristine pavement. My pulse hammered violently against my ribs, a somatic drumbeat of fear and necessity. Before I could state my name, the taller guard's dark eyes flicked to my face. He froze, recognition flashing across his features. He didn't ask for a membership card. He simply pulled the massive oak door open, stepping aside with a respectful nod. The sensory shift upon crossing the threshold was immediate. The freezing noise of the city street vanished, replaced by the pressurized silence of extreme wealth. The air inside was warm, thick with the scent of aged mahogany, expensive leather, and fine cigar smoke. A man in a bespoke charcoal suit appeared silently, gesturing for me to follow. He led me through a dimly lit hallway into a sprawling private lobby. The room was populated by men who exuded a quiet, heavy danger. They sat in clustered leather armchairs, speaking in low murmurs, their assessing eyes missing nothing. As I stepped onto the thick Persian rug, a creeping ripple of silence spread across the floor. I felt simultaneously invisible and hypervisible. I was an exhausted waitress in a faded wool coat, intruding upon the inner sanctum of the city's most feared syndicate. "Signorina Vance," my escort said softly, gesturing toward a tufted leather sofa. "Please take a seat. The boss is concluding a meeting. He will be with you shortly." "I'll stand," I replied, my voice tighter than I intended. I absolutely refused to sink into those plush cushions. Doing so felt like surrendering my last shred of defensive armor. Instead, I stood my ground in the center of the space, clutching my worn purse against my chest like a physical shield. The cheap strap dug painfully into my palm, grounding me in reality. I could feel the heavy weight of curious stares pressing up against my spine. Low whispers broke out among the mobsters nearby, quick, evaluating glances at my frayed cuffs and pale, defensive face. They were trying to calculate my value, trying to understand why a working-class woman had been granted immediate entry into Dante Severino's private fortress. I ignored their murmurs, locking my knees tightly to keep my legs from trembling. The intense heat of the room was making me sweat beneath my heavy coat, but I didn't dare remove it to expose my cheap uniform. I kept my gaze fixed on the double doors at the far end of the lobby, bracing myself to face the only man in this city who possessed the power to dismantle Julian's threats. The heavy mahogany doors to the private office shut behind me, the sound isolating us from the noise of the club and sealing the space in absolute silence. The air smelled richly of aged mahogany, dark spices, and a faint trace of expensive tobacco. It was a room designed for quiet, unchallenged authority, lined with brushed steel accents and dark leather walls that seemed to absorb the ambient, golden light. I felt hyper-aware of my damp canvas sneakers sinking into the thick, plush rug. The sheer contrast between my threadbare coat and the surrounding, untouchable luxury should have made me shrink back into the shadows. Instead, I forced my spine to lock perfectly straight. Dante sat behind a massive obsidian desk, his bespoke charcoal suit jacket draped casually over the back of his chair. He didn't speak immediately. His dark, fathomless eyes tracked my movement across the floor, silently assessing the rigid tension coiled in my shoulders. I stepped forward, my throat feeling like cracked parchment. Reaching into my bag, I pulled out the crisp, white envelope containing the nightmare my ex-husband had hand-delivered earlier. The paper felt heavy, loaded with the immediate threat of losing my entire world. I didn't slide it across the surface with a trembling hand, or cast my eyes downward in defeat. I placed it down deliberately, making sure the edges aligned perfectly with the corner of Dante's pristine leather blotter. "The custody petition," I stated, my voice coming out slightly raspy, but entirely steady. "My ex-husband is filing for full physical and legal rights to Toby. He intends to use my financial situation against me in court to prove I am an unfit mother." Dante leaned forward, the leather of his chair barely creaking under his weight. He didn't offer empty, polite sympathies. He simply picked up the stapled packet, his large, scarred hands handling the cheap legal paper as if it were a minor insect that had crawled onto his desk. The silence in the room stretched, thick and pressurized, as his eyes scanned the aggressive demands drafted by Julian's cut-rate lawyer. I watched a muscle feather along his sharp jawline. The temperature in the office seemed to drop several degrees, a sudden, freezing lethality radiating outward from the man across the desk. Yet, the danger was not directed at me. It was a cold, highly calculated fury, aimed entirely at the name printed on the petitioner line. "I am not here to beg for a handout," I continued. Refusing to let the heavy silence break my defensive resolve, I dug my fingernails into my palms to stop the slight tremors in my wrists. "You offered me an investment. You told me my grandfather's legacy meant something to your family. I need legal intervention. I need the kind of structural power that Julian cannot bully, manipulate, or buy. I will work off the debt of your attorneys, whatever the cost, but I cannot lose my son." Dante finished reading the final page. He didn't toss the pages aside in a theatrical display of anger. He set them down gently, smoothing his thumb over the harsh crease of the paper, his expression completely unreadable and entirely terrifying. "You do not owe me debt for this," the Mafia boss murmured, his voice a low, gravelly vibration that resonated deeply in my chest. "A man who uses the law to terrorize a mother is not a man. He is a pest, and pests are simply removed." He stood slowly, his imposing height instantly commanding the vast room. The shift in his posture changed the air pressure around us. His sheer physical presence made my breath catch, an involuntary reaction to apex danger that my body still instinctively recognized. But as he rounded the edge of the obsidian desk and stepped into my immediate space, the cold aura dissipated, replaced by the radiating heat of his body and the distinct, grounding scent of bergamot. His gaze shifted downward, landing on the open zipper of my worn canvas tote, resting on the chair beside me. Tucked securely between my meager belongings was a familiar, battered object, Lorenzo's journal. Dante reached out, his movements incredibly slow, deliberately giving me time to step back if I felt threatened. I didn't move a single inch. I stood rooted to the thick carpet as his calloused fingers brushed past my frayed wool sleeve and gently touched the worn leather spine of the notebook. The visual contrast was striking. This lethal, impeccably dressed enforcer, treating the fragile, peeling cover of my grandfather's writings with absolute, reverent care, as if he were handling a sacred relic. "He recorded everything in this," Dante said quietly, his thumb tracing the faded gold embossing on the cover. "The old codes, the proper dialect, the exact measure of respect owed to a man's lineage. He carried it every day until he died," I whispered, the tight knot in my chest finally beginning to loosen. "It was the only thing of real value he left behind. The only thing Julian couldn't take from me in the divorce, because he couldn't read it." Dante's eyes flicked from the journal up to my face. The sheer intensity of his stare anchored me to the floor. There was no pity in his expression, only a profound, uncompromising recognition of my daily exhaustion and my stubborn pride. "Julian is a coward who preys on the isolated," Dante stated, his tone carrying the absolute weight of a finalized verdict. "But you are no longer isolated. The blood of Lorenzo Bianchi flows in your veins, Eliza. That makes you part of a history much larger than this city." He withdrew his hand from the bag, instead lifting it to hover just inches from my face. I held my breath as his knuckles lightly grazed the curve of my jaw, the warmth of his skin a stark shock against my cold, wind-chapped cheek. It wasn't a demanding touch. It was a physical promise of absolute safety. "The words inside this journal are more powerful than any legal contract signed by a fool," he promised, his voice dropping to a hypnotic, possessive register. "Your grandfather built the foundation of my family's honor. I will not allow his descendant to be hunted by a weak man. Julian Kincaid's petition is already dead." I closed my eyes for a fraction of a second, letting the sheer magnitude of his protection wash over my frayed nerves. For 3 grueling years, I had fought every battle alone, calculating every penny in the dark, terrified of every heavy knock at my apartment door. Now, standing in this cedarwood-scented sanctuary, with the city's most dangerous man, standing guard over my family, the crushing weight of survival finally began to crack. A few hours later, the harsh fluorescent lighting of the service station at Bellini's buzzed above my head. A low, irritating hum that mirrored the bone-deep exhaustion, settling into my shoulders. I wiped down the stainless steel prep counter with a damp rag, the sharp, chemical smell of industrial degreaser burning my nostrils. Despite the quiet promise of safety I had received in Dante's mahogany office, my body remained wired with a thrumming, restless tension. I kept mentally calculating the cash tips resting in my apron pocket, figuring out exactly how much I needed for a late-night cab back to the hospital to check on Toby. My uniform was stiff and uncomfortable, a stark reminder of my place in this glittering room. Suddenly, the heavy kitchen doors swung open, entirely devoid of the smooth, practiced grace usually demanded of the waitstaff. Julian stormed directly onto the floor. My stomach plummeted. He shouldn't be here. Not during the peak of dinner service, and certainly not in the middle of a dining room, where the city's elite paid hundreds of dollars for pristine, uninterrupted ambiance. The abrasive scent of his cheap synthetic cologne cut immediately through the rich, buttery aromas of truffle oil and roasted garlic. His face was flushed, his jaw set in that familiar, erratic tightness that always preceded a domestic storm. "Julian, you cannot be in here," I hissed, stepping out from the service station and physically blocking his path before he could disrupt the main floor. He didn't even slow down. He pushed past my shoulder, backing me against the edge of an empty corner booth, completely indifferent to the hushed murmurs of the patrons sitting nearby. "You think you can just ignore my calls, Eliza?" he snapped, his voice echoing far too loudly across the room. "You think you can play these little games with me?" From the corner of my eye, I saw Marcus Briggs, our usually tyrannical restaurant manager, hovering near the swinging doors. Instead of intervening, instead of doing his job, and throwing out a man who was clearly harassing an employee, Marcus made direct eye contact with me, then ducked his head. He took a step backward, letting the kitchen door swing shut, effectively abandoning me. The realization was a freezing splash of water against my chest. I was completely on my own, just a disposable worker left to the wolves. Julian reached into the inner breast pocket of his wrinkled suit jacket and pulled out a thick, violently folded stack of legal papers. The custody petition, the mere sight of the crisp white pages, and the blue notary stamp made the air trap painfully in my throat. He slammed the heavy document down onto the dining table with such chaotic force that it knocked over a crystal salt shaker. The delicate glass tipped and rolled, spilling fine white grains across the freshly pressed, immaculate tablecloth like a scattering of snow. "Sign the waiver," he demanded, his finger jabbing repeatedly at the dotted line on the bottom page. "You sign it right now, and maybe I won't completely ruin you in front of the judge tomorrow. Look at yourself. You don't have a lawyer, you don't have a dime to your name. Stop making this so incredibly difficult, and give me my son." My hands shook violently, but I forced them behind my back, hiding the tremor from his gloating eyes. "I am not signing away my little boy to a man who couldn't even bother to remember his birthday," I said, my voice dropping to a low, desperate whisper that scraped against my dry throat. "Get out of my workplace, Julian. Right now, before I call the police." He let out a short, grating laugh that clawed at my nerves. He snatched a heavy silver pen from the server's station and shoved it violently into my palm, his fingers wrapping around my wrist in a harsh, bruising grip. "You're pathetic. You know that? You really think anyone is going to help a broke, exhausted waitress keep a sick kid? Sign the damn paper, Eliza." The polished brass bell above the front entrance of Bellini's chimed, a bright, polite sound that was entirely at odds with the sudden, crushing shift in the room's atmospheric pressure. It wasn't a gradual quieting of the crowd, it was instantaneous. The melodic clinking of expensive silverware ceased. The soft jazz playing over the hidden speakers seemed to drown beneath a heavy, absolute silence. The temperature in the dining room felt as though it plummeted 10 degrees in a matter of seconds, replacing the warm, convivial air with a thick, suffocating weight. Julian, utterly oblivious in his tirade, kept his hand clamped tightly over mine, attempting to physically force the pen toward the bottom of the custody petition. But my attention had already snapped toward the front of the restaurant, my pulse leaping into my throat. Dante Severino stood in the entryway. He wasn't moving quickly. There was no rush in his long stride, no visible tension on his sharp, aristocratic features, yet the sheer lethal weight of his presence sucked the oxygen straight out of the room. He wore a bespoke charcoal suit that seemed to absorb the dim restaurant lighting rather than reflect it, his dark, fathomless eyes scanning the space before locking onto our corner booth with the terrifying precision of a predator, identifying a target. Behind him, 3 men in equally immaculate tailoring stepped inside, fanning out to block the exits with silent military coordination. The unmistakable aroma of his bespoke cologne rolled across the dining floor. completely obliterating the stale smell of my ex-husband's cologne. Dante walked slowly across the imported tile floor. No one spoke. Even the wealthiest, most arrogant patrons at the surrounding tables sat frozen in their seats, instinctively recognizing a kind of primal, untouchable power that could not be bought or reasoned with. Julian finally noticed the unnatural silence. He turned his head, his mouth opening to bark another insult at me, but the cruel words died instantly on his tongue. Without a single word, the Mafia boss slid smoothly into the leather booth. He sat directly beside my ex-husband, their shoulders nearly brushing. The physical contrast was jarring. Julian in his wrinkled, off-the-rack jacket, sweating, and beginning to tremble, seated next to a man who looked as though he owned the very air we were breathing. Julian tried to pull his hand away, but Dante moved faster. The billionaire raised his large, calloused hand and placed it gently, almost softly, over Julian's trembling fingers, the exact fingers that were currently gripping my wrist. "You are making a mess," Dante murmured, his gaze dropping to the spilled salt on the tablecloth. His voice was low, smooth, and terrifyingly calm. It didn't echo, yet it commanded the absolute attention of the entire room. Julian's face drained of all color, his skin turning a sickly ashen gray. He stared at the large hand covering his own, his chest heaving as the sheer gravity of his mistake finally registered. I'm just," he stammered, his eyes darting frantically toward the three massive men standing silently at the edge of our booth. Dante didn't even bother to look at him. His dark gaze drifted up from the legal document, moving past the scattered salt until his eyes met mine. The cold, lethal emptiness in his expression vanished for a fraction of a second, replaced by a quiet, absolute promise of protection. "Remove your hand, or lose it," Dante instructed. His tone was conversational, polite even, as if he were simply asking for a glass of water. Julian snatched his hand back as if he had been burned by a hot iron, scrambling desperately against the leather seat to put as much physical distance as possible between himself and the predator beside him. The heavy silver pen clattered uselessly onto the floor, rolling away into the shadows beneath the table. My wrist throbbed with a dull ache where Julian had gripped it, but the pain felt entirely distant now, completely overshadowed by the massive, grounding warmth radiating from the protector sitting across from me. Julian's chest heaved beneath his cheap polyester blazer, his face flushing a volatile, frantic red. He had always relied on volume to win his battles, mistaking physical intimidation and loud aggression for actual authority. "You think you can just walk in here and intimidate me?" he spat, though his voice cracked noticeably on the final syllable. "I have rights. I'm taking my son, and if you or this bitch try to stop me, I'll call the police. I'll drag her through civil court until she doesn't even have a pot to piss in." The ambient noise of the restaurant seemed to drop another 10 decibels. A few feet away, a water glass on a tray rattled slightly from the sheer, suffocating tension radiating across the floor. The man standing beside me didn't flinch. Dante Severino merely tilted his head, his dark, fathomless eyes absorbing Julian's outburst, like a stone wall absorbing a gentle breeze. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't even unbutton his tailored charcoal jacket. He simply raised 2 fingers in a silent, precise command. From the periphery of the dining room, a tall, impeccably groomed man, in a slate gray suit, stepped forward out of the shadows. He carried a heavy leather briefcase, the silver clasps gleaming under the recessed lighting. Moving with the clinical efficiency of a surgeon, the lawyer bypassed Dante entirely and set his briefcase onto the nearest linen-draped table. The metallic snaps echoed sharply in the quiet room. "Mr. Kincaid," the lawyer began, his tone perfectly even, completely devoid of emotion. "My name is Arthur, representing the Severino family's legal interests. We took the liberty of reviewing the financial affidavits you submitted during your divorce proceedings." Julian froze. The hostile bravado drained from his posture, replaced by a sudden, rigid panic. That's sealed. You have no right. A shell corporation registered in Delaware under your mother's maiden name," Arthur continued, ignoring the interruption as he pulled a thick stack of bank records from the case. "Routine deposits totaling $84,000, cleverly timed exactly 3 weeks before you filed for separation. Furthermore, we have the routing numbers for the wire transfers you used to conceal your marital assets, claiming you were completely bankrupt to avoid paying child support." My pulse thudded in my throat. I stared at the neatly printed papers fanned out across the white tablecloth. For 2 years, I had lost sleep, skipped meals, and counted the remaining scoops of baby formula. Because he swore to the judge there was nothing left. I had worn the soles of my shoes down to the pavement, walking to the hospital in the freezing rain to save bus fare. He had called me paranoid. He had made me feel insane, all while he was siphoning away the stability my child desperately needed. Now, the truth lay exposed under the harsh glow of the chandelier. The paper trail of his betrayal was undeniable. Tax fraud, perjury, deliberate concealment of assets, the lawyer listed calmly, tapping a manicured finger against the top document. The IRS would find this deeply fascinating. A federal judge would likely mandate a minimum sentence of 5 years. That is, assuming the evidence makes it to their desks. Julian's mouth opened and closed. He looked like a fish suffocating on a dry dock. He glanced frantically around the room, searching for an exit, but the broad-shouldered security detail blocking the doors hadn't moved an inch. Dante finally spoke. His voice was a low, lethal rumble that cut through the silence like a blade through silk. "You thought you were a predator," he murmured, taking a slow, deliberate step toward the trembling man. His distinct, masculine fragrance drifted past me, grounding my racing heart. "You thought you could hunt in my city. You were mistaken." The sheer gravity of the room seemed to press down on Julian's shoulders, forcing him to shrink. The arrogant ex-husband who had cornered me in alleys and screamed through my apartment door was entirely gone, replaced by a sweating, terrified coward. Arthur reached back into the leather briefcase. He withdrew a crisp, newly printed document and placed it squarely on the table, right next to the damning financial records. It was a direct counter to the custody petition Julian had weaponized against me just hours ago. "This is a full relinquishment of parental rights," Arthur stated, sliding a heavy Mont Blanc pen across the linen. "It irrevocably surrenders any claim, visitation, or legal authority regarding Toby Vance. Once signed, you will cease to exist in their lives." Julian stared at the heavy black ink at the bottom of the page. A bead of sweat rolled down his temple. He looked up, his eyes darting toward me, searching for a trace of the weak, submissive woman he used to control. I kept my chin raised. I didn't offer a single word of comfort. I simply watched him with a cold, unyielding silence, letting the absolute weight of my protector's power shield me from his toxic gaze. The man who had mocked my waitressing uniform and laughed at my strayed cuffs was currently begging for his freedom. Julian swallowed hard, his voice trembling so badly it was barely a whisper. "I can't just give up my son." "You never had a son," Dante corrected softly. The chilling finality in his tone left no room for negotiation. "You had a hostage, and the hostage situation is over." He leaned slightly over the table, resting his large, scarred hands flat against the pristine white cloth. The gold cufflinks at his wrists caught the light, a stark reminder of the immense wealth and authority backing his every word. "Sign the paper, Julian, or I will let my attorneys destroy your freedom, and then I will personally address whatever is left of you." It wasn't a threat. It was an absolute guarantee. A pathetic, strangled sob escaped the back of Julian's throat. He reached for the silver pen, his fingers fumbling awkwardly against the smooth metal barrel. When he pressed the nib to the signature line, his hand shook so violently that the sharp point caught the thick paper. With a sharp, tearing sound, the edge of the document ripped under his frantic pressure. He didn't stop to fix it. He hastily scribbled his name, the jagged, chaotic loops of his signature reflecting his absolute terror. The moment the ink settled, he dropped the pen as if it had burned his skin, stumbling backward away from the table. Arthur neatly collected the torn, signed page, sliding it into a protective clear sleeve, before clicking the briefcase shut. The nightmare was over. A piece of paper that had haunted my every waking hour, threatening to tear Toby from my arms, had been completely neutralized in a matter of minutes. Not with street violence or screaming matches, but with calculated, institutional annihilation. Dante straightened his posture, buttoning his jacket with slow, elegant precision. He did not even look at the trembling man cowering against the far wall. "Leave," the boss commanded, turning his back on Julian entirely. I stood frozen in the center of the dining room, listening to the frantic, squeaking scramble of my ex-husband's rubber soles as he bolted for the exit. The heavy glass doors swung shut behind him, severing the last tie to my old, exhausted life. Dante turned toward me, the lethal coldness in his eyes melting into a quiet, focused observation. He reached out, his large, warm hand lightly brushing my shoulder. "It is done, Eliza," he murmured, his thumb tracing the frayed edge of my collar. "He will never approach your family again." My legs suddenly felt incredibly heavy. The adrenaline that had kept me standing for hours was rapidly draining away, leaving only the profound, dizzying reality that my greatest terror had just been erased by a single signature. Julian's retreat was frantic, entirely devoid of the aggressive, manipulative swagger he had worn when he first cornered me. The heavy glass door of Bellini's swung shut behind him, the brass latch clicking into place with a definitive, hollow sound that echoed through the empty dining room. The silence that followed was absolute, heavy with the lingering electricity of the violence that had just been quietly averted. I stood frozen in the center of the room, staring at the polished mahogany table, where the signed relinquishment of parental rights still lay next to a sleek obsidian pen, the oppressive, suffocating weight that had crushed my chest for 3 years, the constant, grinding terror of losing my son to a man who only viewed him as a pawn, suddenly evaporated. The realization hit my nervous system all at once, overwhelming the adrenaline that had been keeping me upright. Toby was safe. The legal ambush was dead. We were finally free. My knees, rigid and trembling for the past 14 hours of my double shift, abruptly gave out. I collapsed into one of the velvet upholstered chairs at the nearest table, my hands gripping the armrests so hard, my knuckles turned a sharp, bloodless white. A violent, irrepressible shudder tore through my shoulders, sending a fresh wave of exhaustion deep into my bones. I pressed my palms over my mouth, desperately trying to stifle the ragged, ugly sob that forced its way up my throat. The cold, drafty air of the restaurant felt completely disconnected from the burning, feverish heat flushing my face. I braced myself for the typical response of a powerful man in this situation. A heavy hand on my shoulder, a sudden invasion of my personal space, a smug expectation of immediate gratitude for saving me. But nothing touched me. Through my blurred vision, I saw the immaculately tailored charcoal suit pants, standing several feet away. Dante Severino had not stepped closer. With a subtle, almost imperceptible tilt of his chin, he dismissed the remaining attorneys and security personnel. They faded back into the shadows of the restaurant, slipping out the side exits with the silent, practiced efficiency of ghosts. Only when the room was entirely empty of his entourage did he finally move, and even then, his steps were measured, deliberate, making no sudden sounds that might startle me. He stopped a respectful, highly calculated distance from my chair. He did not reach out to stroke my hair, nor did he attempt to crowd my fragile, shattered state. Instead, a large, calloused hand simply extended into my line of sight, offering a perfectly folded, crisp white linen handkerchief. "Breathe, Eliza," his voice rumbled, quiet and steady, cutting through my panic to anchor me to the present. That familiar, comforting aroma drifted over me, completely erasing the stale, sour scent of Julian's cheap cologne. I took the handkerchief with a shaking hand, pressing the cool, soft fabric to my eyes. His physical restraint, the profound, old-world respect of giving me the space to fall apart without turning it into an opportunity to assert his dominance, spoke louder than any of the lethal threats he had just leveled at my ex-husband. I spent a long time just breathing into the linen square, forcing my erratic pulse to slow down to a manageable rhythm. When I finally lowered my hands, the tears had stopped, leaving my skin feeling raw and my chest incredibly hollow. I waited for the inevitable logistical nightmare to return. I expected him to tell me to gather my things, to return to the damp, peeling linoleum of my apartment where the radiator clanked uselessly against the November chill. "The immediate threat is neutralized," Dante stated, his fathomless obsidian eyes watching me with a calm, analytical intensity. "But you cannot return to your current residence. Not tonight, not ever." My defensive instincts flared instantly, a reflex honed by years of poverty, exploitation, and the constant fear of unpayable debts. I quickly calculated the reality of my bank account. The meager tips from tonight wouldn't even cover a cheap motel. I can't afford to go anywhere else right now. The hospital bills, this is not a negotiation of rent. He cut in smoothly, his tone leaving absolutely no room for argument. There is a private estate on the northern edge of Lakeshore Drive. It belongs to my family. It is heavily secured, completely isolated from the noise of the city, and fully staffed. I stared at him, my throat completely dry. The concept of a private, staffed estate was so far removed from my reality of counting pennies for generic brand asthma inhalers that it felt like a foreign language. "You want me to move into your family's estate? I want you to have the sanctuary Lorenzo's granddaughter deserves," he corrected softly. He stepped just a fraction closer, sliding a hand into the pocket of his suit jacket in a gesture of relaxed, absolute authority. The property has an extensive Old World library. Thousands of volumes, many of them original Sicilian texts, poetry, and historical ledgers. It requires someone with your precise linguistic education and cultural understanding to organize and preserve them. It was a job offer. A carefully constructed, deeply dignified reason for me to accept his shelter, without feeling like a helpless charity case. He was giving me a way to earn my safety, protecting my pride, just as fiercely as he had protected my physical person. But I was still terrified of the invisible strings attached to such a massive leap in class and security. "And Toby?" I whispered, my maternal anxiety immediately overriding my own pride. "He's fragile. The cold drafts, the dust. The hospital just stabilized his lungs." Dante's expression softened, a subtle shift that made him look remarkably human, stripping away the cold Mafia boss exterior for a fleeting, intimate second. "The estate has a state-of-the-art central air purification system. The grounds are expansive and entirely private. Your son will have room to run, to breathe, without you ever having to check the color of his fingernails or ration his medication again." The mention of Toby's asthma, the casual, absolute promise of clean air. It hit me harder than the sight of Julian surrendering his parental rights. To a mother who had spent countless nights listening to her child wheeze in a freezing room, that promise was worth more than all the wealth in the city. "I cannot leave my son in a precarious environment," Dante continued, his voice dropping an octave, taking on that possessive, absolute certainty that demanded compliance. "By bringing you under my roof, I am honoring a sacred debt I owe to Lorenzo Bianchi. But more importantly, I am ensuring that no one will ever look at you with disrespect again." He wasn't asking me to submit to his power. He was offering a fortress. A gilded sanctuary, perhaps, but one where the doors locked from the inside, keeping the predators out. The profound, aching exhaustion in my bones felt incredibly heavy. And for the first time in my life, the idea of surrendering my grueling independence didn't feel like a defeat. It felt like coming home. The absolute pressurized silence of the estate felt foreign against my eardrums. For 3 years, my Bertisline reality had been a chaotic symphony of urban decay. I was conditioned to the rattling of loose window panes, the persistent hiss of the hallway radiator, and the distant wail of sirens piercing through the thin drywall of my old apartment. Here, the world was completely muted. The thick, soundproofed glass of the towering windows held back the city's frantic energy, leaving behind a tranquil sanctuary bathed in soft afternoon sunlight. I stood in the center of the expansive primary suite, my stockinged feet sinking into the plush cream carpet. The temperature was perfectly regulated. A gentle, continuous warmth that seeped into my permanently chilled bones. There was no draft, nor any dampness creeping up from the floorboards. Just the faint, immaculate scent of lavender and lemon polish hanging in the still air. On the enormous 4-poster bed behind me, Toby was fast asleep. His chest rose and fell in a steady, unbroken rhythm. I stood perfectly still for several minutes, simply listening to the quiet sound of his unobstructed breathing. The wheezing that usually accompanied his afternoon naps was entirely gone, completely banished by the state-of-the-art air purification systems Dante had installed throughout the rooms. I pressed my fingertips against my own chest, feeling the frantic, defensive knot of anxiety that usually resided behind my sternum slowly begin to unravel. I turned my attention to the heavy mahogany writing desk, positioned beneath the main window. My meager belongings looked almost comical in this vast gilded space. A single duffel bag held everything Toby and I owned. I unzipped the canvas fabric, reaching past the folded stacks of worn cotton shirts to retrieve the single most valuable item I possessed. My fingers traced the cracked, weathered leather cover of Lorenzo's journal. The familiar tactile sensation grounded me instantly. I carried the notebook over to the desk, laying it down on the polished wood surface. The afternoon light caught the fine golden edges of the old paper, illuminating a lazy stream of dust motes, dancing in the sunbeams above it. I rested my palm flat against the cover, closing my eyes. I could almost hear Nonno Lorenzo's deep, booming laugh echoing in the quiet room. He had written these pages to preserve our family's honor and history in a strange new country. He could never have imagined that his careful, elegant cursive would become the key that unlocked this sanctuary for his great-grandson. I pulled out the heavy leather chair and sat down, tracing the grain of the mahogany wood. I didn't feel like an intruder anymore. The exhausting, invisible barrier of poverty that had defined my every waking moment felt distant, replaced by a profound, terrifying sense of security. The quiet peace of the afternoon shifted subtly around 4 o'clock. The main entrance door closed with a soft click, followed by the distinct, measured tread of leather dress shoes. A second later, his commanding dark fragrance drifted into the living area, lowering the barometric pressure of the room. I stepped out of the kitchen, wiping my damp hands on a hand towel. Dante stood in the center of the sunken living room. He had discarded his suit jacket, though he still wore a crisp charcoal waistcoat over a perfectly tailored white shirt. His sleeves were rolled up, exposing the dark ink winding around his forearms. He wasn't looking at me. His full, undivided attention was entirely focused on the floor. Toby was sitting cross-legged on the Persian rug, surrounded by the heavy, hand-carved pieces of an antique marble chess set he had discovered on a low coffee table. My breath hitched in my throat, a reflexive spike of maternal panic, warning me that my 3-year-old was touching something priceless. But Dante simply lowered his massive frame onto the floor, folding his long legs with surprising grace, until he was seated directly across from my son. "That one," Dante murmured, his voice a low, soothing rumble that barely disturbed the quiet air, "is the knight, Il Cavaliere." I froze in the archway, leaning my shoulder against the doorframe to watch. Toby looked up, his big eyes wide with curiosity, clutching a black marble horse in his small, pudgy hands. He didn't shrink away from the towering, lethal man sitting in front of him. "Horse," Toby declared proudly. "A horse, yes," Dante agreed, the dangerous edge of his usual tone entirely absent. He reached out, his large, calloused fingers gently tapping the marble board. "But a knight does not move in a straight line, Piccolo. He jumps. He protects the king by stepping over the obstacles in his path. 2 steps forward, 1 step to the side, like this." Dante guided Toby's tiny hand, helping him move the piece across the checkered squares. The contrast was staggering. This was the same man who had systematically dismantled Julian's entire existence, with cold, terrifying precision, just a few days ago. This was the feared syndicate boss whose mere presence made powerful men sweat. Yet here he was, sitting on a rug in his waistcoat, dedicating absolute patience to a toddler's clumsy movements. 2 steps, Toby repeated, mimicking the motion with a white pawn. "Exactly," Dante praised softly. He didn't patronize my son. He spoke to him with a quiet, steady respect that commanded Toby's complete attention. A warm, heavy ache bloomed in the center of my chest, traveling down my ribs. I had spent so long acting as a human shield for Toby, fighting the entire world alone just to keep him breathing. Watching Dante effortlessly step into that protective void broke down the final, stubborn wall of my pride. The terrifying Mafia boss wasn't just a gilded cage or a dangerous benefactor. He was stepping into the role of a guardian, claiming my son's safety with the same absolute devotion he applied to his empire. Dante slowly turned his head, his dark, fathomless eyes finding mine in the doorway. He didn't startle, clearly aware I had been standing there the entire time. The corner of his mouth curved upward in a microscopic, private smile. Something in that quiet domestic tableau anchored my soul. The air in the estate gardens held the crisp chill of late November, a sharp contrast to the heated silence of the penthouse I had just left behind. I pulled the charcoal cashmere shawl tighter around my shoulders. It was a garment that had simply appeared, draped over my bed earlier that evening, smelling faintly of cedarwood and bergamot. I stepped off the marble terrace and onto the manicured gravel path. Ahead of me, a tall, broad-shouldered silhouette stood near the edge of the stone balustrade, overlooking the dark expanse of Lake Michigan. Dante Severino wore a bespoke overcoat that absorbed the moonlight, his posture rigid. A lit cigar was held casually between his gloved fingers, illuminating the sharp, patrician lines of his jaw as he took a slow draw. "You should be inside, Eliza." His voice cut through the silence. He didn't turn around. "The wind off the lake is unforgiving tonight." "Toby is asleep," I said, my voice steady, though my breath plumed in the freezing air. "I needed to speak with you. Alone." He finally turned. Those dark, fathomless, obsidian eyes locked onto mine. He lowered the cigar, the rich scent of expensive tobacco, mixing with the cold night air. He waited in total stillness, offering nothing but absolute attention. "I never properly thanked you," I began, my throat feeling suddenly tight. "For Julian, for the lawyers, for taking a nightmare that has suffocated me since Toby was born, and dismantling it in 10 minutes on a restaurant floor. You legally eradicated him. You gave me my son's life back. Instead of accepting the deference, his expression hardened. He took a slow step toward me, closing the physical distance until the immense heat, radiating from his large frame, began to combat the biting chill of the wind. "Do not thank me for that," Dante commanded softly, his tone brokering no argument. "You owe me no gratitude for removing a parasite from your life." Crushing Julian Kincaid was not a favor. It was the settlement of a sacred debt. I looked up at him in genuine confusion. A debt? To my grandfather? Lorenzo Bianchi did not just teach me the old world dialect, Dante explained, his voice dropping to a low, resonant register. He taught me the architecture of respect. He taught me that a man who wields violent power, without understanding the historical precision of his language, is merely a brute with a gun. He used to rap my knuckles when I butchered a vowel, telling me that a sloppy tongue makes for a sloppy leader. He paused, bringing his intense gaze back to my face. "Your grandfather built the foundation of the man I had to become to survive this syndicate. A man who forgets his teacher's legacy, who allows his mentor's bloodline to be hunted by cowards, has no right to call himself a boss. Protecting you, it is not an obligation. It is my absolute honor. Never insult yourself by calling my protection charity." The silence stretched between us, heavy and profound. I reached into the deep pocket of my coat, my freezing fingers brushing against the worn leather cover of Lorenzo's journal. I didn't need to open the fragile pages. The ancestral rules of respect and the precise grammatical structures were already burned into my memory, passed down in quiet kitchens while the rest of the world slept. I looked Dante straight in the eyes. I refused to look away, refusing to let the vast disparity in our material wealth and social power make me feel small ever again. I drew a slow breath of the freezing air, feeling my chest expand with a new courage. "Se avessi saputo il peso della tua lealtà, non avrei mai temuto l'ombra del tuo potere," I said, my voice ringing clear and steady in the quiet night. I watched his reaction carefully. I had deliberately used the exact subjunctive grammar case, the precise, ancient conjugation that I had boldly corrected him on back at Bellini's. It translated roughly to, "If I had known the weight of your loyalty, I would never have feared the shadow of your power." I followed it immediately with a traditional Sicilian blessing, the very same one Lorenzo used to whisper over my crib. "Che la pace che hai donato alla mia casa diventi le fondamenta della tua. Lorenzo sarebbe orgoglioso dell'uomo che sei diventato. May the peace you have given my home become the foundation of yours. Lorenzo would be proud of the man you have become." Dante froze. The glowing tip of his cigar hung motionless in the dark. For a long, suspended second, the lethal, untouchable Mafia boss vanished, replaced by a man struck entirely silent by the ghosts of his past. I could see the slight shift in his broad shoulders, the way his breath caught fractionally in his chest. Then, slowly, the hard, dangerous lines of his face began to change. The corners of his mouth twitched, and the cold obsidian of his eyes warmed, softening into something deeply human. Dante Severino broke into a rare, genuine smile. It wasn't a smirk of dominance. It was a profound, quiet expression of absolute peace. "Ice tu possa non dover mai più combattere da sola, Eliza," he murmured in a flawless, deeply accented response, intentionally using the informal, intimate structure. "And may you never have to fight alone again." He reached out, his calloused hand gently adjusting the heavy cashmere shawl around my freezing shoulders. The gesture was careful and fiercely protective, grounding me in the immediate physical warmth of his presence. The cold November wind continued to howl off the dark waters of the lake, rattling the bare branches of the oak trees lining the estate. But as I stood there in the quiet garden, looking up at the man who had effortlessly destroyed my demons just to ensure my son could breathe, the freezing air couldn't touch me. The agonizing, bone-deep exhaustion of my past had finally vanished. I was no longer a ghost haunting my own life, invisible and constantly running. I was standing exactly where I belonged, anchored by a legacy of honor, safe in a sanctuary built to last forever.